And in this clip, Tucker asks J.D. Hall, who's actively standing against dispensationalism. Let me play the clip and then we'll talk about it.
Is there any popular Protestant American Christian leader who is explicitly rejecting dispensationalism and all that its political implications?
So what's happening in evangelicalism is a complete fracturing of the movement as a whole, so that the big name leaders like your John MacArthur's and your R.C. Sproul's, those guys are dead, basically, is what's happening. So there's a balkanization that's basically happening in American Protestantism and evangelicalism.
So it was very interesting, his answer to this question. The specific question was, is there anybody who's actively against dispensational, just teaching against it? And in a sense, I guess, I honestly wouldn't know. But what I would know is that dispensationalism does not present as dispensationalism in higher church. It just doesn't. That's just not what happens. It's presented as an eschatology, which is a study of the end times. The rapture, probably the biggest, most well-known dispensational. Again, this is why it would have been good for him to have gotten further into Ryrie, because after Ryrie, you get the Left Behind series, and you get, 9, 12 books of the Left Behind series, and you can't understate that fiction further propagating. I mean, these were number one best-selling books. Most of them were. And in the Christian community, these books were talking about the end times in a way. I don't know when it was, but missing that. So you've got Ryrie in the 90s. There's a conversation we'll talk about here in a little bit between MacArthur and Ryrie, also in the 90s. And then there's the Ligonier ministry movement, the Reformed Presbyterian movement that started to get pretty strong. But then in the 2000s, you've got this Left Behind series that is just further propagating the dispensational. You don't hear, probably not once would you have heard the term dispensationalism. And I mentioned in episode 7 that the biggest guy who promotes it is Dr. David Jeremiah. So what's interesting to me is I quit looking at this subject matter and this discussion back in 2016, and I don't think much has changed in terms of who you would talk about. And it's funny to me that J.D. Hall immediately says that the people that you would think of who would be standing against this, like John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul. Listen, J.D. Hall, this is where this got difficult for me. As somebody who objectively was in this conversation back then, I was a nobody. Uncredible then, uncredible now. But I was in the middle of this back then, and I'll tell you the answer to this question. There's one answer. There's one answer to somebody who is standing up against dispensationalism explicitly. But they wouldn't be standing up against dispensationalism. They'd be standing up against a premillennial view of the end times. And the answer to that question is James White and Jeff Durbin of Apologia Church and Studios. James White has his own thing called Dividing Line as well. It's interesting that he doesn't even bring up their names. He does bring up two other, I would say obscure, maybe they're bigger than I realized, that I didn't recognize. So I'm not going to get into something that I don't even know about. So if you want to listen to that and check those things out, go for it. I might. We'll see. But JD, knowing personally James White, I don't know if he knows Jeff Durbin, but knowing James White, and they had a falling out back in the day, knowing him and not making it very clear that there is one guy who would be more than qualified. Yeah, it's true that he would not be like the level of R.C. Sproul or John MacArthur, but to pick John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul over James White for this conversation is interesting. And I'll tell you why. Because, first of all, as he noted, they're both dead. So is there anyone actively, currently big-name person against it? No, they're dead, okay? Worse, John MacArthur, for all intents and purposes, was a dispensationalist. He would call it dispensationalist light, and him and R.C. Sproul had this weird relationship where they agreed on Calvinism, which is a view of salvation, And I think Sproul preferred to set the dispensational conversation aside and elevate the salvation conversation. And this goes back into the 90s, where MacArthur and Ryrie, the guy who wrote the book, literally wrote the textbook for the class that I took at a seminary level. He and Ryrie had a back and forth of 2 books, and it was this conversation of lordship salvation. And nobody knew that what was at the root of it, I shouldn't say nobody, but nobody in regular public life knew that what was really at the root of that was a difference in dispensational theology and how they fleshed that out. And MacArthur never went so far as Ryrie did with his belief in dispensationalism, but he was a dispensationalist. And if you look up prominent dispensationalists, like who teaches it today, MacArthur comes up. So it's weird that he chose MacArthur, but MacArthur was a prominent Baptist. The Master's Seminary in California is a big seminary. I'm pretty sure they teach some kind of dispensationalism. They certainly teach premillennial eschatology, which is end times. I'm sure they do. Rapture, God still has some plan for the Jews. That's the position of a light dispensationalism. And then R.C. Sproul, who is Presbyterian. Now, R.C. Sproul is one of my favorite theologians of all time, but he had the opportunity to walk this road. And I think he made an active decision not to deal with the issue of dispensationalism for the reason that a lot of people don't want to deal with it. One, you get really deep into the weeds. It presents itself as primarily an end times theology. And so when you're talking about Christianity as a whole, eschatology is sort of like, we don't really know. We're all doing our best, and so we can set this one off to the side. But if we're talking about salvation, this is more important. So I think RC made the decision to say, let's not die on the battle hill of eschatology when I've got this stalwart of justification by faith alone, lordship, salvation, John MacArthur. They team up and they start doing stuff together. They became really good friends. But what's interesting is prior to his friendship and relationship with MacArthur growing and building from the early 90s into the 2000s, R.C. Sproul was heavily promoting Dr. John Gerstner, who was one of his professors in college. And Dr. Gerstner, I think, is the only person that I'm aware of who ever directly went after dispensationalism as a theological. He would have considered it a heretical position. Now, I'm sure there were other people who have done it, but John Gerstner's book, Wrongly Dividing the Word of Truth, was a direct address to all the issues that we're talking about. And he kind of nailed MacArthur in that book. Like, he kind of pointed out that this dispensational theology is problematic on so many levels. But the problem with Sproul and Gerstner is they were coming at it from a perspective of Presbyterians, not Baptist. And so Baptist's perspective of a Presbyterian, because they have different views on baptism and infant baptism, they're not going to respect those teachings from someone else. Because if you got it so wrong on Baptist, this is how a Baptist would think. If you got it so wrong on baptism, how much more did you get it wrong? So it's tough for a guy. But John Gerstner's book, Wrongly Dividing, is one of the, it's hard to find. I mean, I don't know if you can get it anymore. I don't know if Ligonier publishes that anymore. But Gerstner clearly saw this theological problem and how it permeated all aspects of theology. And Sproul made a conscious decision, I think, at the end of Gerstner's life to say, hey, we're not going to make Presbyterians and Baptists can unify on justification by faith, on Calvinism as well. And Ligonier can bring all these sort of Baptists in and start teaching them theology. And MacArthur made the same choice. He was like, I can make this I can die on this battlefield of dispensationalism, which to them I think was generally just an eschatology more than anything, and focus on these other more important issues. And that's the subtle way that dispensationalism creeps into anyone's theology. It's sort of tacked on at the end of the doctrinal statement as, God still has a plan for Israel and then the end times. And most people, they start getting into that and they're just like, sure, you've done the research, pastor. You theologian, you've done all that research. That's getting into the weeds for me. So what I found interesting is J.D. Hall, when asked specifically who would be the biggest, most prominent people who would oppose dispensationalism, and the answer to that is James White and Jeff Durbin. I mean, I haven't followed the whole thing, but I don't know that there's any controversy. I looked very briefly. Both James White and Jeff Durbin are both still doing their ministries effectively as they have when I was doing it, looking at them decades ago. And more so with, you figure dispensationalism is about 200 years old, maybe 150 years old, give or take. I don't know. I don't know the whole timeline. It's barely a century. It's barely 2 centuries old. And James White has been doing the dividing line for half a century. So who's best positioned to address it? And they're linked up. So Apologia and James White and Jeff Durbin are all linked in some way. I thought, last I knew, James White was like sort of like a pastor emeritus or something. He was part of that church, Reformed Baptist Church. Who else is there? There might be other people, but to me, the fact that he didn't name them, even in passing, was just kind of surprising. And really, I think the best person, I could be wrong about this, but I think the best person to address this issue would be Jeff Durbin. I don't know how he would do. He would definitely nail the eschatology side. I don't know how he would be on the actual dispensational teachings specifically, but I think Jeff Durbin would be the best guy. I don't know James White's background with dispensationalism, but he would be fine. He would be more than fine. And the reason I say that is because, as far as I'm aware, and maybe this has changed since then, but J.D. Hall did okay on the Tucker Carlson show. I think he did great. He did fine. But he comes with the baggage of his history, where James White and Jeff Durbin, active ministries, no scandals, would have been perfect. And you wouldn't have this immediate, now let me say this. The reason I picked Jeff Durbin over James White is because there is like a group of people on social media and in the interwebs that just hate James White for how he talks. He does, for some people, come off a little bit arrogant, like a know-it-all. He's got that boomer feel to him too, which rubs people the wrong way. He doesn't care, so he just says, but I mean, he has the knowledge base and the expertise, and he would work really well on a show like Tucker Carlson, but so would Jeff Durbin. So I'm just blown away. I'm not blown away. So this is where you get into the question of why J.D. Hall again. It's like he's going to reference R.C. Sproul, who specifically whether he made a conscious decision or an unconscious decision, chose not to take dispensationalism on when it mattered, which would have been a decade ago, and to call out this issue of Israel and the church and elevating Israel in that theology. And then MacArthur, who he might not have been a full-on dispensationalist, but would have still felt and held. I mean, you could probably go to his commentaries today and see that God still has a plan for Israel. So it's just kind of confusing that those would be the guys you would mention. And the reason that JD doesn't mention James White is because they had a falling out. And so I looked it up because I'm like, surely James White has something to say. And apparently he deleted a tweet. I mean, this reads just like it used to. But he says, I see the trolls are active today. Guess that's not unusual. My point about Hall was, for those who think and know a little of his history, I sadly know way too much of it. My point was obvious. After crashing and burning his ministry and the church he pastored, getting in trouble with the law, and admitting to drug addiction, Hall disappeared and allegedly moved quietly to a farm. Essentially, the point is J.D. Hall is not the best person to have this conversation because of his history and his track record. So, and that is why he doesn't mention them. And it's kind of unfortunate, because what would have been nice here is if J.D. Hall had said, some other guys that may not like me saying it would be Jeff Durbin and James White. You know, if he had just mentioned them and then led Tucker to other people who would be adequate in addressing this, It would have been great, but he didn't do that. And I think that's because there's still some issues there. But I mean, here's the deal. The answer to Tucker's question is James White and Jeff Durbin. That's it. I mean, I don't know how you could come up with a different question. I'm sure somebody will argue with me, but for me personally, that's immediately who I thought of. Now, on this clip, and then we'll move on, another great question that didn't get asked, which I would have loved to have heard the answer to, would have been, what prominent people are explicitly promoting dispensationalism? Because this is where it gets weird. Not too many people explicitly teach it, right? It always emerges as an end times study. That's not that important, but it's important, you know. And then God has a plan for Israel, and then it goes down that, and just trust me on this. And I don't know how you get away from Dr. David Jeremiah not being the one guy that's still alive who teaches and promotes this. There might be others, but it's going to be interesting to see in the coming weeks how those people emerge. Because now because J.D. Hall and Tucker Carlson talked about it, it can't masquerade as if you don't agree with it, or God's always had a plan for Israel, or if you don't agree with it, you're an anti-Semite. Now they have to actually address the subject from a theological standpoint. It'd be interesting to see how people like that and who emerges to do that.
No quit. Building their wall. While they talk about us. All they talk about us. Educated. Experienced. Still not credible. So we embraced it. Now we're uncredible.